good to go.
Okay. So, anyway, while George is looking at the lights, good morning. Nice to see you. I am going to be obviously talking about food flavor. It's certainly been a passion or a love of mine for a good deal of time. When I was a student and went to National IFT, at that time, students were really welcome. They'd have hospitality suites everywhere. And I found a couple of them that were absolutely just lively places. And they were all joking with each other, had a great time all night, and then they all left. And I found out they were all from different companies. I thought they were the same company. And they all ended up being from different flavor companies. They were competitors. And I thought, well, that's kind of neat. It was interesting. Everybody knew everybody. It was like a family. And I thought about flavor too. You know, if you focus on a given area, get a job in a company, very commonly you're pigeonholed. You tend to put into one area. And I thought, no, flavor can work for anybody. Flavor works for meats. It works for any kind of plants, any kind of thing we process, every food. So I just like the diversity, and I like the opportunities that flavor provided in cutting across all different categories of food. So, yep, that's been my area. It's been my love and passion, certainly. This is where I'm going to put some effort today. I have, well, I shouldn't say today, in the 3 lectures that I have. Start off talking about, first of all, what is flavor. So we're kind of on the same page. I won't go into it quite as much detail as the slides will suggest. I want to leave you with an idea, not a great deal of detail in that area. So talk about what is flavor, a little bit of olfaction, basically smell, and of course cover taste, so that comes from the mouth, so we got the nose and mouth area. Talk about desirable flavors, off flavors, and I don't know if I'll finish up with labeling. We'll see how time goes. I might take a little bit of time to talk to you about how flavors are created in the food industry, or I should say in the flavor industry. Very few people ever see the flavor industry. It's some industry that exists that serves General Mills, serves Cargill, serves basically all of our consumer companies. Probably the only flavor company you see is actually McCormick and Company, because they do both. They supply flavors to the industry and they sell products to the consumer. So if time permits, we'll get into a little bit of that. So that's kind of what we hope to accomplish. And so the idea of what is flavor has really changed recently. We've been using flavors for a long time. I mean, historically, obviously, since time began, put plant materials, spices, herbs into foods and flavored them. But kind of the sophistication of flavoring started with discovering vanilla, actually vanillin. So people had been using vanilla as a flavoring. And a chemist finally, in something like 1887, identified what is the component in vanilla that gives it its flavor, and that is the chemical vanillin. And so the industry has then looked for what causes flavor, what's responsible for flavor, and has worked towards duplicating it. So whatever nature used, obviously people have to use to recreate that flavor sensation. And so the industry is really focused on smell or aroma. That's what they've considered to be flavor. They do put, yes, some salt, some sugar, put other components in that are taste components. But when you talk about the flavor industry, they've always focused on aroma, and the industry, food industry, has supplied the taste components of it. So it kind of comes for 2 different directions. The food industry itself, the consumer industry, and the flavor industry come together to provide that overall sensation. So in the past, it's been a fairly simple definition. It's been primarily aroma, but we've learned more and accepted the idea that taste plays a more important role. And certainly the idea of heat of spices, the cooling of menthol is another sensation that goes into our perception of flavor. We then also have decided, well, maybe there are things that influence our smell, influence us beyond simply these chemical stimuli. And that's gotten us into kind of this diagram here, where we start thinking, well, we got a lot more going into it. And so we do get our taste, we get our odor across here, coming in to form final sensations down here. But it's also all these other things that go into it. When you bite an apple, you expect to hear a crisp. There's a sound to it. There's a texture to it. There's a mouthfeel to it. There's an appearance. Have any of you ever done this where you taste different sodas, call them pops, and they've been miscolored for you? And then they ask you what flavor are they? 90%, I think it's about that high, you get it wrong. If it's brown, it's cola. Doesn't matter if it happened to be 7-Up. Doesn't matter if it happens to be some other flavor. We also use our eyes. And so our eyes, our mouthfeel, the texture, the aroma, the taste, the heat of spices, cooling menthol, all come together ultimately to form a perception. And you know, if they're not all there, something's wrong with it. Something's wrong. Our brain is accustomed to saying, I get all this when I get this beautiful apple. And if that's not all there, it isn't right. So in some places we come close to duplicating nature, but I don't believe we've actually duplicated nature in any particular instance, because we need to deliver this whole circle of sensations. We're going to stay with the chemical senses, though, for our discussion. So I'm not a sensory scientist. I don't go that direction. Zeta Vickers does. Okay. So I deal more with chemical senses. And so I'm a chemist by training, and I look at the chemistry of flavor. What chemicals do we need in our food to make it taste right? Or if it tastes bad, what chemicals are there that shouldn't be there? And so that's my bag, so to speak. So let's go ahead and look at the chemical stimuli. The taste, aroma, and chemesthesis. Chemesthesis might be called other names. Again, that is what we call the cooling of menthol, heat of spices. And interestingly, we have some interesting other ones that come along that I'll mention a little bit later. We start off with taste. So that's on the tongue. We've got our taste buds on the tongue. And in other parts of the mouth, but focus certainly on the tongue. And people generally agree, salt, sweet, sour, bitter, umami. I don't know how many of you have heard of umami as a word? Is this from sensory class or is it someplace else? Zeta Vickers 3102? Okay, good. She should get that across. So actually the consumer isn't necessarily familiar with, they're familiar with monosodium glutamate or MSG taste, or they might call it a savory taste. But as a chemist, yep, there's the umami. There's been some discussion about fat receptors. Can we actually taste fat? There's kokumi that people in Germany have decided should be a taste also. So there are other things, but if we look at what really people accept and accept across the board, it tends to be these 5 sensations. You think about receptors on the tongue, there's something like 10,000 different taste buds. I shouldn't say different. Let's say there's 10,000 taste buds on the tongue as an adult. And again, some of you might have participated where you put a dye in and the dye marks the taste buds, they get color from the taste buds. And we differ in that sense. Some people are super tasters. Some people are more sensitive to taste. And you'll find they have more spots, more dye markings on their tongue. So again, some of you might have participated in that. Some of us don't taste much at all. So we got quite a range in terms of sensitivity. But like I said, we have approximately 10,000 taste buds on the average tongue. And like I say, people vary in sensitivity. We find that different parts of the tongue vary in sensitivity to the various tastes. There's been a tongue map, and I don't know if it shows up on these slides or not, where they kind of say, well, sour is here, sweet is here, bitter is here, and so on. And that's really not accurate. There is different parts of the tongue that are more sensitive, but it isn't nice, clearly defined. This is where sweet is. That's where sour is. They tend to be over the tongue. So the tongue may be a little more sensitive in some areas to one taste, but they are all over the mouth. And so we've got certainly a number of receptors. This is an image of a taste bud, and this taste bud will contain all of the senses, all of the receptors for those tastes. So every taste bud does have the ability to taste all of these components, but it'll be more sensitive to some taste components than other taste components. And so we think, well, or maybe you'll think that salt, sweet, sour, bitter, umami isn't very complicated, but it is. When we say sweet, some of you probably like artificial sweeteners, high-potency sweeteners. Some of you like sucrose. They're different. Sweet is different. There's something like 37 different bitter receptors. There's different characters of bitter. If you think of acid, tartness, citric acid is very much citrus. You look at lactic acid, sour milk. Acetic acid, vinegar. So when I say there's 5 tastes, 5 basic tastes, don't think there's just one version of each of these 5s. It is still a complicated sensation. Aroma outdoes it, though, when it comes right down to it. So let's not say taste is simple. Aroma is extremely complicated. And aroma may consist of several hundred volatiles. I like coffee. Coffee and chocolate, okay, baked bread. 3 things that I absolutely love, I live for. And these are extremely complex flavors. Anything that comes out of roasting, toasting of foods tends to be much more complex in terms of its chemistry than simply a plant growing, a basil plant or a tomato. So when we start heating things, we form a lot of chemicals. So when I say several hundred, a cup of coffee, they've identified almost 1,000 aroma chemicals in that cup of coffee that could potentially contribute to the sensation of coffee. And the coffee you like is a particular blend of those 1,000 chemicals that you say, I like it. If that blend is changed, if it's changed in processing, changed by source, changed by whatever, you're going to get a different blend. You're not going to be as happy with it. So we can look over 1,000 chemicals in some foods. Most plants, like I say, they're simpler. We're probably talking 200 chemicals, 300 chemicals that the plant produces in one way or another that we can respond to as contributing to aroma. The fun part of this is, from an analytical standpoint or chemistry standpoint, you're not looking for one chemical when you're looking for flavor. You're looking for 100. You're looking for 900. Wonderful analytical challenge. And also, we're exceedingly sensitive to some aromas. Some aroma chemicals. This is a methoxypyrazine. A methoxypyrazine, sensitive to about 10 to the minus 17th grams. If you get that quantity up in your olfactory region, you sniff and you get 10 to the minus 17th grams of this chemical as aroma, you'll say, man, that's a green pepper. Where's that green pepper coming from? It's just amazing. Earthy. You may notice earthy character sometimes, maybe in fish farms, fish farms of products where there's a little bit of pond smell, or maybe you've got fish sometimes that have an earthy note to it. Many of our sugars contain a little bit of earthy character. Comes from geosmin. We're talking about parts per trillion or less in terms of sensitivity. So we can be amazingly sensitive to chemicals. We developed a really, really good receptor system for this over time. And so can be exceedingly complex, exceedingly sensitive. And some other things like ethanol, it almost takes a bucket of ethanol before you end up noticing it, at least in compared to some of our other chemicals. So aroma, complex, and potentially present in trace quantities. We can be exceedingly sensitive to it. The process of sensing how we as human beings detect these aroma chemicals was really advanced a few years back. Actually, a person or two people, Linda Buck and Richard Axel, shared a Nobel Prize for chemistry in identifying how we smell, how human beings go about perceiving odors. It's rather interesting. So here's our nose and air pathway, so it comes up this direction. So I'd give you something to think about for a moment. When you put some food in your mouth and you chew that food, there's not much air mixing. You can chew and breathe at the same time, and your airway is kind of separate from where you're chewing, where your food is. But when you swallow, that food goes down the same pathway the air was coming up. And so when you swallow your food, you'll exhale. We call it an exhale breath. You always exhale after you swallow something. And so the air comes back out where that food just went down. And that air that's coming out samples whatever you just swallowed and comes up to your olfactory region, comes up here, gets detected by your olfactory receptors, and sends signals to the brain. And so that's kind of how it works. It's really the breath brings volatile compounds, aroma compounds, up to our receptors here. This is a kind of a blow-up of this section. So here's our airway, so air coming here through here and going out our nose. There's kind of a mucous membrane here with then basically receptors here. And so these receptors here will grab onto any kind of aroma chemicals. They'll send a signal down into here, which goes directly into the brain. There's only one pathway through our skull into the brain. Only one. And that is for this purpose, olfaction. Our brain processing is immediately adjacent to all of these receptors. We've been set up to really be sensitive quickly to different odors. And if you would think about this as a potential evolutionary process, protection. What's our first sign of this lion coming around the corner? Maybe smell. You want to be able to pick it up right away, and decide to go someplace else. Maybe you can think of different rationale reasons on that one. But the idea is we're exceedingly sensitive, we're very quick at it. We also adapt fairly quickly. You may notice somebody's working in a laboratory, they're working someplace, you walk in and say, my God, this place stinks. And the people won't notice it. They've adapted to it. And part of that adaptation is they will still pick up other odors, but they've adapted to what's there and now are looking for new odors to come in, and they're sensitive to new odors. You might think that smokers, which we have less and less of perhaps, aren't as sensitive to the sensory or these types of stimuli, but they can be. They can be actually very sensitive to it. You adapt to it, the smoke odor, that background, and they still pick up the other character, the new characters. So, real direct pathway in the brain, very rapid response, adapt so they can detect new odors. So this is kind of the idea. Here are different receptors, and I forget, was there 150 million? I don't know. I think a slide coming up talks about the number of receptors we have. So I think we've got about 1,000 different types of receptors, and this just picks out 2 receptors. And so in the first case, here's our odorants. Our odorants must have the right chemical composition, the right shape to fit into these receptors and give a stimulus. So if these molecules don't fit into the receptor doesn't notice those molecules. But if they will fit in, and in this case, maybe only one of them fit in, or maybe it's a low concentration, only one fits in. Only one of the two receptors give a signal. And so we'd find maybe it's the right character, maybe that's weak. So it could be a weak sensation. If we get a lot more molecules and they will fit in, we can stimulate more and more receptors. The more receptors, the more intense. There are some cases where it's claimed that odor changes with strength. The character changes with strength. And that's not always well proven. It's oftentimes when things are in low concentration, they can be pleasant. If they're in high concentration, they can be unpleasant. If you will take apart, by take apart, I mean isolate the aroma from a food product, you can find some of the most interesting smells. We typically do that in our laboratory. We take a food, we do some kind of isolation, we solvent extract, we concentrate the solvent extract, we put it into an instrument that separates this complex flavor into individual components, and then we sit at the end of the instrument and we smell each of these as they come out of the separation device, a gas chromatograph. And so some of them can be really interesting. You know, you'll find things that will be like fecal, they'll be phenolic, medicinal, wet dog, one of my favorites. I got 2 dogs, so I call that good. But you may not think that's good in a food product. But they're there at low concentration, and at low concentration, they kind of fill in the background. They're so low, you don't really notice them as being objectionable. But if they get high concentration, you think, oh, wait a minute, my food shouldn't be tasting like a wet dog. There's something wrong with it. So we kind of look at this sensation, concentration, how they interact as being really, really interesting. In most cases, what happens is after you mix 3 chemicals together, you can't really identify those 3 chemicals anymore. Up to 3 chemicals, you can say, oh, I smell this, this, and this. But I guess it's number 4. By the time you put the 4th one in, they come together to form something different. And you can no longer detect what the components are. You come up with a new sensation. So it's a fascinating area. And the idea there are odor-binding proteins, that's what's down here. So there's odor-binding proteins. Those odor-binding proteins grab onto an aroma compound, they bring it to the receptors. That's where things start happening up here, is you'll find that when you bring a certain chemical to a certain receptor, it opens up a channel into your olfactory region where ions will flow in. So this certain combination of chemical will make or open up a pathway where ions will flow in, an ion channel will open. And that cell will take on a negative charge or electrical charge. Electrical charge, nerve impulse. Nerve impulse goes to the brain. And so this is where the people got, Axelrod and so on, got their Nobel Prize, is figuring out how this receptor works, how these ion channels get activated so we can get nerve responses. Fascinating, absolutely fascinating area. So over 1,000 different receptors. Every molecule, odor molecule, will trigger many receptors, so it's more of a pattern recognition thing. And the brain then takes that pattern. Gee, I've had that before. Oh, that was a strawberry I had before. I recognize that. This pattern is the same as I had from strawberry. It's strawberry. And so it's an interesting process that our brain goes through and goes through very, very quickly, very efficiently. So this chemist thesis, that's, like I say, the heat and cool of spices or menthol and so on. That's kind of the third one. It was called trigeminal before, and decided that it's just not the trigeminal nerve. There are other nerves that actually respond as well. So a broader term has been tended to be used for talking about this group of chemicals. And we find them on the tongue, the mouth, the lips, the throat, the olfactory region, and on the way out of the body. So it's interesting how these are distributed. We generally think of it being in the mouth, but if you smell certain chemicals, you will find you also have these pain receptors. And that's basically what they tend to be. These chemicals will stimulate pain receptors. So when we actually, it's interesting, when we get something that's hot, a cayenne pepper, whatever, red pepper, you can think of many things, those chemicals are stimulating exactly the same nerves in your mouth that a cup of hot coffee would, a hot object would. Those same nerves can be firing and giving the sensation of heat because of heat, or a chemical can make them fire. So it's again fascinating. You ever wonder how you can break out in a sweat, from eating something cold, from eating, a spicy food? Your brain says, oh man, that's the same receptor, that's heat. I'm perceiving heat. And in fact, it's induced by chemicals. So it's again another fascinating one. We came across one of the things we have fun with too is looking at off flavors in foods. Why don't they taste right? And we got some cookies. Some people came in with cookies and said, Gary, there's something wrong with these cookies. When I eat these cookies, I get a mouth numbing effect and it feels like somebody's tapping on my tongue. You think, what? And we went ahead and took the cookies all apart, isolated the components from the cookie, and then did tasting of them. And there was one particular chemical that stimulated the sense of feel. So it wasn't just heat, it wasn't cold, but when you put that chemical on your tongue, on your mouth, anywhere, it would feel like someone was touching it. And strangely enough, this chemical had only been identified in jambu, which is a plant that's grown in Brazil in the Amazon forest. How that got into a food packaging material, you kind of wonder about, because the cookies that touched the food package all had that sensation. If the cookie didn't touch the food package, it didn't have that feeling. And now this chemical is actually used in some of your oral health care products. The companies are looking for new things, different sensations, different ways to make a mouthwash interesting, perhaps. So it was a rather interesting one. Well, that's a little bit about sensing of flavor and a little bit about what flavor is. So let's go on and talk about flavor formation in plants. We'll go ahead and start with that. I'm sure you're well aware that flavor forms differently in fruits versus vegetables. If you think about it, the mechanism has to be different. Have you ever seen a green carrot, a carrot that isn't ripe yet? Have you ever seen a beet that isn't ripe yet? Vegetables don't ripen. Fruits do ripen. And so there's very much of a difference in how these plants develop their flavor. And we distinguish between, like I say, vegetable flavor formation and fruit flavor formation. In vegetables, you have to do some cellular disruption. You've got to mess that cell structure up. So it might be slicing, dicing of a vegetable, even cooking, during cooking. What the idea is that in a plant cell, I'm going to have a big cell, how's that? We'll enlarge that plant cell a little bit for us. Everything's organized. Our enzymes are over here. They're doing their thing to produce growing, to have things happen inside that cell. So they're all organized. And things don't get screwed up. They don't get messed up. Nature put everything in its place. But once you disrupt that cell, once you cut it in half, you slice it, dice it, crush it, like I say, you disrupt that cellular organization. Now those enzymes and those precursor materials are free to mix. They're not free to mix in the plant as it grows. They're free to mix when you do some kind of disruption to that plant cell. And so your flavor is formed very, very quickly from this mixing of enzymes in the cells with the precursor material that are in those cells. If you take an onion, for example, you can hold an onion up and you can look and laugh at it. There's absolutely nothing in that onion that's going to irritate your eyes. There's nothing in that onion has any flavor characteristic of that onion. But as soon as you slice it, believe me, you get that odor, that character very, very quickly. So, vegetables, we have to somehow disrupt that cellular structure to develop flavor. If you look at fruit, of course, it does have a ripening period. There's a world of difference between a green pear and a ripe pear. Any kind of a green fruit versus a ripened fruit. And so it's the same kind of process, though. The plants have all of these mechanisms going on inside as they're growing and getting to the ripe stage. But when they start getting ripe, then you start losing that cellular structure again. It's cellular organization again. And so then we start getting the enzymes and substrates missing, and we develop flavor or color during that final ripening period. So that happens naturally in fruits. They have a ripening period. Cellular organization goes away. We get the mixing and flavors developed. So these are just a couple of different diagrams going to be coming up about where does the flavor come from, what are the precursors of it, what are some of the primary enzymes, what are the primary flavor compounds that come out of them. And so this happens to be looking at vegetables. And so what are the major precursors, the reservoirs for flavor? Amino acids. Over here we've got carbohydrate. And over here, we have fatty acid or lipid metabolism. So, your lipid metabolism going along fine, you're building carbohydrate structure, you've got your amino acids there, everything runs along fine until, like I say, you do some disruption. Then some of these enzymes that are coming across here will attack these materials. So they'll attack them, and they'll come down and they will bring us flavor or aroma, taste compounds down on the bottom. And again, you can see where we get some nice sulfur compounds, some other sulfur compounds here that come primarily from amino acids. Over here, of course, we have a lot of carbonyls, alcohols, and so on, acids coming down here. Isothiocyanates, again, more sulfur. We actually can find a fair number of sulfurs. Sulfur is exceedingly important to flavor. For some reason, we have developed the ability to detect extremely low amounts of any kind of chemical that contains sulfur. Nitrogen too, but not to the same extent as sulfur. So it's interesting. So these tend to be our mustards. It'll be our horseradish. It'll be those wasabi, whatever you can think about that's in that category. Harsh, really potent chemicals. And like I say, they're all sulfur containing. This is a radish, and I wouldn't expect you to memorize or lose too much sleep over each of these chemical pathways that I show you. But I guess I just want to give you an idea of kind of what's happening here. So up here is our precursor. That precursor happens to have a sugar molecule attached to it. So our sulfur side chain, this gets involved in synthesis of the plant. It's there for a purpose. But there's a sugar attached to it. As long as the sugar is attached to it, it isn't going to be able to vaporize. It's not going to be able to come up and be into your olfactory region. So as long as that sugar's there, it's impossible to smell it. But when our enzymes attack it and our glucose or sugar gets chopped off, then we have some intermediates that go on to form more intermediates and ultimately, again, a whole group of chemicals. It's, I don't know if I put information here or not, but a fun experiment can actually be done at home. If you happen to be a gardener, what do we have up here? We've got sulfur compounds. If your soil is rich in sulfur, you can grow radishes that will burn your mouth. They are so harsh, so strong. If you happen to have soil that's very deplete, very low in sulfur, You'll have very, very mild radishes. You know, we don't really necessarily think of vegetables differing in flavor. We think of apples, gosh, the different apples, they all taste different, or they're apples, yeah, but they're different, or our fruits, they're different. But we don't ever think, well, gosh, where are those radishes? Wherever were they grown? What kind of radishes? What was the soil nutrition, and so on. We'll come back to that later on. But there's great diversity in vegetable flavor, as much as fruit flavor. But we're just not conscious of it. Say, you go and you buy one kind of carrots, right? And we think that's all there is. But boy, there are different types of carrots, and they differ very much in terms of flavor and where they're grown. It's fascinating. So our sulfur compounds, again, influenced very strongly by how much sulfur is in the soil, how much sulfur that plant can pick up. Mustards are fascinating. I used to get phone calls, probably 2 or 3 a year, from some company that says, my mustard loses its flavor. One of those companies was McDonald's, and they said, we'd love to give some nice, potent mustard flavor to our customers, but the mustard loses its flavor. Anytime you buy a prepared mustard, something yellow in the jar, or brown for that matter, in a jar that's kind of a paste, prepared mustard, they are bland. You never get one of those that are strong. They're very weak in character. Why? Because those sulfur compounds that the plant produces on, macerating, processing, and so on, they're not stable. They chemically degrade. They hydrolyze. And they hydrolyze to something that's not very interesting. So our mustards, our yellow-brown mustards you get in the jar, are pretty darn wimpy when it comes right down to it. And there's no way to stabilize that. If there's water, that flavor is going to break down. And that there is water added to the mustard powder to produce these. So what do? You really want to get a good kick out of something? You take a powder, you grind the mustard, or you grind the wasabi. You have a powder, you add water to it, you put it on a plate, and you give it to someone. That will cure your head cold. It'll clear your sinuses. You'll probably all have had wasabi or something like that one time or another that is on the strong side. That comes from using a powder or a fresh material, for that matter, grinding it and using it in your product. So yellow mustard, the primary chemical for this is an allyl isothiocyanate. The brown mustard is a little bit different in character. Its primary flavor component is para-hydroxybenzyl isothiocyanate, but both of them are unstable. They're just not going to be delivered to the consumer in a prepared form. This is onion. Again, onion, very important for flavor, sulfur compounds. What's its precursor over here? It's an amino acid. This amino acid happens to have a sulfur group down here with an oxygen coming off the side. So there's got to be a double bond to that oxygen. They sometimes get rearranged in drawings, but okay. We need to have 2 bonds to oxygen here. And so cysteine sulfoxide, again, a part of synthesis, a part of what the plant's doing, the onion's doing. But again, as soon as we do some damage to this, enzymes will come and attack this. They'll split off this group down here, this group comes up here. It's chemically unstable, and it goes down this way to form thiols, sulfides, disulfides, trisulfides. There's something like 70 or 80 of these chemicals in onion that contribute to its flavor. And again, all comes from this precursor here and different, substituents coming down on this side. The lacrimatory compound, and what does that mean? It's the one that brings you to tears when you're cutting an onion. This is, again, one of those pathways and one of the compounds. So our group here is just a propane group. So if you look to the previous slide with the R group here happens to be propane. And so this is the chemical. It breaks down into thiopropanol S oxide. This is what irritates you. And so that's what brings you to tears. It's interesting that this compound is, again, unstable. And so if you chop your onions, whatever you happen to do to them, if you do that quickly, come back in 5 minutes, there'd be nothing there that's going to irritate you. That chemical is unstable. It breaks down. I was on television one time on a science program, and that was their theme. How do you slice onions without breaking into tears? And they had different suggestions from different people, different places. One said, well, cut your onions, dice them under water. Have a light stream of water running over it, and then it'll wash those chemicals down the sink. Of course, you got to have a colander or something to catch the onions that you're slicing in the process. Another idea was, well, go ahead and put them in the refrigerator. So the onions are cold. Enzymes work more slowly at low temperatures. My solution, I thought, was the best. I got to come in with a big hammer, whop the onion, smash it and run. That was my contribution to science. I did get the opportunity to explain why that worked, and that's what made it happen, or why I got to be on the program. So I was the technical expert, but it's just, I'm sorry, it's just fun. Sometimes you got to do that. Anyway, fruit flavors. So let's change from vegetables to fruit. We've really got a number of chemical reactions that go on here. They're always, again, enzyme-catalyzed reactions. Our aliphatic amino acids, so we have just our carbon side chain that's coming off of different amino acids. You think about the amino acids we have, right? We've got glycine, we've got a lysine, alanine. You could go through all of them that have this nice just carbon side chain. And they will then be broken down. They'll be hydrolyzed by enzymes into alcohols, and there will be some acids also. So they're going to split them up. And what happens then you'll have another enzyme in the plant that converts alcohols and acids into esters. And so if you got enough side chains, different combinations, you have different acids in there, you can end up with several hundred different esters that can be produced by this pathway. We have aromatic amino acids. Phenylalanine is probably the nicest example. And what happens when they're attacked by these same types of enzymes, they end up giving you benzene rings, aromatic esters that are formed. And they will tend to give you a spicy character. I don't know if I forget what comes up next, but anyway, in one of these things, if you take a ripe banana and taste for a ripe banana, and taste it, the difference between a green banana, ripe banana, there's a spicy character to the ripe banana. It's kind of like clove. It's a little bit clovish. It's very subliminal. And that clove character comes exactly from this reaction in the ripe banana. The aromatic amino acids being broken down and combined to form eugenol and other chemicals that'll give us a slightly spicy character to it. Fat, of course, is a great precursor. What do we have? Lots of nice free fatty acids. So we get free fatty acids. Here's where acids can come from that react up here, react here for that matter. So we got a number of acids that come out of it. But there's also enzymes in there that change these acids into alcohols, change them into aldehydes, carbonyls, and so on. So again, fat is really a big precursor of flavor. Our terpenes, if you think about that, they're best known for our essential oils, orange oil, lemon oil, the citrus family. And they actually come from the sugar pathway. So carbohydrates, the building blocks of carbohydrates, also form the basis for terpenes. So if you think about it, here's our amino acids, here's fat, and here's where sugars come into these pathways, each contributing flavor. This is just an example of how a fatty acid up here, so this is a fatty acid, it happens to be a fatty acid in pairs. There's enzymes that will break down that fatty acid. It chops 2 carbons off at a time. So it chops off two, chops off two, chops off two. Come across, you'll react with an alcohol then, that acid with alcohol to form an ester, and it forms these esters, or family of unsaturated esters. So this is 12 carbon, 10 carbon esters. That's what pear gives it flavor. For some reason, there are enzymes in pear that are really good. First, the pear produces the right fatty acids, and for some reason, there's the right enzymes in there that attack those and bring them down a pathway to give you unique end products that make pears taste like they do, the character of pears. So I guess maybe I'll get back to the radishes here. So like I say, enzymatic processes, enzyme-controlled processes are what we get our flavor from. The idea, what influences flavor, genetics, obviously. When you go ahead and buy an apple, that's one type of an apple, another variety of apples and so on, there's different genetic profiles there. That means you've got slightly different precursors. You've got slightly different enzymes. And that ends up in having slightly different flavors. So genetics plays a large role in influencing the flavor of that pear, of that apple, of that orange. And so there's a difference in character. There's also a difference in flavor intensity, potentially. Again, how many enzymes, how many precursors do you have? So genetics controls the character, it controls the intensity. It's interesting, a five-fold difference in intensity of onions depend upon what the variety, just a study that was published, intensity of onion flavor versus variety. The environment is all important. Soil is exceedingly important. That's where so many of the nutrients come from. They come from the soil. If the plant doesn't have the ability to build certain building blocks, it can't degrade them into flavor. And so the study on carrots. Carrots, same variety of carrots, grown in California, very flavorful, very sweet, not harsh. Same carrot grown in Florida, low in sweetness, low in flavor, not much at all. Texas, harsh carrots, in otherwise moderate in character. So again, your carrots differ. It's fascinating. We don't, like I say, we're not typically thinking of that. And this is, like, I thought this radishes would come back here someplace. This is an example where this is the concentration, milliequivalents of sulfur. So it's milliequivalents of sulfur per liter of soil. So you're looking at the quantity of sulfur in the soil where these radishes are being grown. And this looks at the total sulfur volatiles that give you the harsh character of the radish. And just as the soil nutrition went up in this character, the harshness, the aroma chemicals, grew in exactly the same manner. So again, if you don't like radishes, if you can find them grown on wimpy soil, low sulfur soil, you might start liking them. If you like something that's got a good kick to it, okay. Who grows them where there's sulfur? It's interesting. Rainfall is important. And this is kind of interesting that it seems as though there's so much flavor to go around when it comes to rainfall. When we get plentiful rainfall, it seems like you get bigger plants, but there's less flavor in those bigger plants, bigger tomatoes, bigger fruits. And so it's really interesting, a fourfold difference in aroma on a low water regime versus a high water regime. High water, bigger yield, actually less flavor to them. Temperature is very important to us. Warmer growing temperatures may make them grow better, may make them grow faster for that matter, but again, flavor tends to be a limiting note to it. So temperature, maturity, this is one that really drives me crazy, is that we tend to pick plants before they're mature. We pick them and we'll ship them across the country. And what happens? They're picked green, they don't ripen on the tree, they don't ripen on the vine. And they don't ripen the same if they're not on that tree, if they're not on that vine. One example is looking at a study of peaches. artificially ripened, in other words, picked green and allowed to ripen, they only had 20% of the flavor chemicals that a tree-ripened peach had to it. It's fascinating. We get used to it, and that's the part that really bothers me. Is we're getting used to things that are not ripened on the tree. We're getting used to things that aren't what they should be if you did it otherwise. I heard from a plant scientist where he said it took 60 days for green beans to come from Chile to our market. 60 days from picking time to getting to the grocery store. So when we buy fresh green beans at the store, it's not uncommon for them, out of season, of course, to be that old. How did they preserve that? And when they preserved it, what did it do to its flavor? We live in a different culture today than we used to. We live in a different culture than many other cultures live in terms of eating things when they're in season, eating them when we're local, eating them when they're ripe. Well, let's call it quits at this point. So we'll pick this up at this point. If you ever have any questions about this, I'm in room 147. Feel free to stop in.